as well. So yeah, basically today we're going to talk about the policy life cycle. We've broken it up into 4 sections. We've got evaluation, implementation, research, and lobbying. So each speaker is going to speak for like 15 minutes on each topic, and we'll have questions at the end. So I'll just introduce the speakers. We have Gianni LaCava over here. Gianni is the research director at E61 Economic Research Institute and a former senior research manager at the RBA. We have Luke Miller, the director of government relations at Macquarie University. Luke has experience at Sydney Water as head of media and government relations and as communications manager at the Hunter and Central Coast Development Corporation. We've got Mr. David Osmond, current professor of economics at Macquarie Business School. David's got lots of experience working within the RBA as deputy head of the Financial Stability Department and the Economic Analysis Department, as well as mission chief, deputy section head, RES rep in the Ukraine. We've also had We've had a last minute change. We were expecting David Throsby to show, but he isn't available today. Apologies from him. So instead we've got John Romelis, who's the head of the economics department at Macquarie University, on board. So thank you so much, John, for stepping in. We appreciate you doing that. So yeah, as I said, we're gonna try and keep 15 minutes for each speaker, and we'll keep questions to the end if that's okay, just in the interest of time. So if that's all good, we'll get Gianni up first, please. Thanks,
Darcy,
Gianni.
to the slides.
Thanks, Darcy.
Yeah. Is that okay? Do you
Go
want to do it, or
up
do you
the
want me to
right.
do it? Okay, cool.
Top right.
Top right.
Yeah, on play. There you go, mate.
Awesome, thanks guys, thanks for having me. So I'm here today to talk to you about probably my favourite topic, which is doing research, and talk to you about my career as a researcher. I need to apologise in advance that this is a very self-absorbed presentation where I'm just going to talk a lot about me and my experiences, but I do at the end want to sort of give you guys a chance to ask questions and sort of think about it from your point of view too. As I go along, I will try and relate it back to hopefully stuff that's relevant to you guys as well, but I'll be showing off a lot of, you saw there's a bad picture of me for the event. I'm going to continue to show you more bad pictures as we go along of me, but I hope that's okay. Alright, as Darcy kindly said at the start, I am the research director for the E61 Institute, which is a not-for-profit, non-partisan think tank. It's just started up in the last year or so, but one day of the week, Wednesday, I also work at Macquarie University, so I teach at Macquarie as well. So most of the time I'm doing research, and then one day of the week I am teaching. So what I want to do is just give you some background about who am I, how did I get here, so talk you through some big kind of events that happened through my career and got me to where I am and why I like doing policy research. And then I'm going to talk about what is policy research and why you might want to get into it, why you might be interested in it, and yeah, hopefully that's an okay outline for today. Alright, so this, as I said, bad pictures. This is me in undergrad. I was at uni for 6 years, so I did arts and I did commerce, and all the way through, I did not know if I wanted to be an economist. I did not know if I wanted to be a psychologist. I did not know what I wanted to be. I got to the end of 6 years and still didn't really know. In the end, I was convinced by a bunch of friends who had already gone into a place like the RBA to go down that kind of very conventional path. And so I ended up applying to the RBA. I actually didn't get in straight away. I completely fluffed up the interview. Was put on a reserve list, and then somehow a bunch of people pulled out, and I got lucky enough to get into the RBA. So, but at the end of 6 years of uni, I really didn't know what I wanted to do, and I totally understand if you're in a similar position. So this is me at the RBA. You know you hit peak career as a researcher when you become part of stock footage that various newspapers will use of you outside the RBA. This is not set up. This is literally me accidentally caught out the front of the bank a few years ago. Amazingly, someone pointed out to me that you can actually buy this photo through Getty Images. I'm not suggesting you should. I'm not suggesting it's worth $650. But I'm suggesting if you go down this path of going to work for a policy institution, there is the opportunity of getting photographed out the front. And that's when you know you've really made it. Just to continue on this gag, you can also, it turns out, get a photo of the back of my head for the exact same price as $650. I can't imagine anyone actually using this, but it turns out they still use this photo every now and then. They're like, oh, you still work at the RBA? I'm like, no, this is awkward, I don't anymore. Anyway, moving along. So I should tell you what I was actually doing at the RBA. So I started the RBA, I originally worked in the research department, and I felt really out of place. I had only done like 1 year of econometrics in undergrad, and a lot of the focus of what I was doing at the RBA in that first job was econometrics, and I felt really out of the loop on that. I don't know. I can continue without the photos.
Oh, that's awkward.
I'll just keep talking.
Yeah.
I have to remember what's on the other slides.
Just decided to turn off.
Anyway, RBA. So yeah, I was starting off the research department. I didn't know much econometrics. I felt really found out, and I didn't have a very supportive manager at the time. But I got lucky in moving around to different sections of the bank in the time that I was there, and had more supportive managers. Started to find my feet. Started to work out kind of what I could contribute. It didn't have to be in terms of statistics and econometrics. There was other things that I kind of brought to the RBA. I then got super lucky and got a scholarship to go and study and do a master's over at the London School of Economics, and I went and did that for a year, and it was hard, but it was good, and I got to live in London, which is something I'd always wanted to do. I then came back to the RBA after that year, went to another job that I didn't like all that much. I was like, actually, well, maybe I should have done more postgrad, maybe I should have done a PhD. And so I went over in October 2008. I flew back over to London. I landed in London. It was the weekend that Lehman Brothers fell over. You guys know about the story of Lehman Brothers, but it's basically the start of the global financial crisis. And it was just all over the headlines. I was like fresh-faced, starting a PhD. I was just like, right, I'm going to solve all of this. I'm going to come up with the most amazing model, economics model. It's going to solve the whole financial crisis. It's going to have this and that. It's going to be awesome. I went to write down the first equation. And I was like, I have no idea how to do this. This is just too hard. I realized that theory and that sort of stuff wasn't for me. And what I ended up doing was going off and finding an amazing data set that had every single mortgage in the US over the last 20 years, millions and millions of observations. Went into this data set, started pulling out things that I thought was interesting and worth sharing with people, and got like 3 chapters of a PhD out of just doing research with what we call like microdata, or sort of big data. And that became my thing. It hadn't been my thing up until then. But I soon realised that I really like being able to go into these big data sets, finding out something new about the world that other people didn't know, and then sharing it with everyone. I soon realised when I came back to the RBA that it was also part of my brand. It was not a thing that was commonly, that people had, skills that people had at the RBA or in Australia more generally, was this ability to kind of work with big data and granular data sets. It was very popular in like North America and Europe, but less so in Australia. So it became my thing to go around. I built a unit at the RBA that was all about working with microdata, so always looking at sort of things the RBA was interested in, but working with the data set. So that was a big lesson for me, and a big lesson I've got on the invisible slides is about learning what your brand is. It's a bit wanky, but working out what it is about you, and that can take time. It took me 6 years of uni, another 5 years of the RBA, then off to doing postgrad. Coming back, I still didn't really know until then what was my kind of thing. It took ages. But I would actually strongly recommend doing what I did, which is bouncing back and forth between work and uni. So I found that was a good way of like keeping up with the latest in big data, econometric stuff, but I also found it was just a way of keeping things fresh for me. It was actually to constantly jump between the two. I never had the pleasure of like working part-time or also studying. I can imagine that being really challenging, but I always did it full-time, but I kept jumping between the two.
Just a quick explanation for everyone. The computer's fine, but the cameras have overheated, and so we've got to wait for them to cool down a bit before they'll come back on, and I'll do that automatically. How long it takes is a mystery question for everyone.
Missing out so many awkward photos.
And you've got the slides there, don't you?
You guys can see the slides later. It's all good.
Oh, like you've got them there.
Yeah, that's
yeah.
helpful for me.
Oh, okay, cool.
What I also want to talk to you about. So then after RBA, after the PhD. I then got lucky enough to be sort of approached by people like David and to come to work at Macquarie Uni at the same time to come and set up or run a think tank, this research institute. And having been over in the US and seeing what was being done over there, and as I said, like it was a very niche thing in Australia, but not so much overseas, and I kind of wanted to copy what they've done in terms of think tanks overseas. and do it in Australia. And that's basically what I've been doing for the last year, setting up a research think tank in Sydney. All right, so what is policy research? What do I actually do all day? I did come up with a bunch of bullet points that are listed here that we can share with you later. I realised as I did it, it pretty much describes any office job. It's not necessarily policy research. So it says I read and I write papers and blogs and op-eds. I collect, organise, analyse data. I meet with people face-to-face, Zoom, email, and I present research and get feedback, so do seminars and stuff. But that's pretty much the case for a lot of jobs. So it might be of more interest, maybe we can go into this more in the Q&A about how I do research, how do I come up with an idea, how do we realise when an idea is not going to work or a project's not going to work. I think that might be helpful maybe if you're doing some assignments or group assignments. When do you know to kind of cut your losses and when do you know to keep pushing? Happy to talk about that at the end, but I've got some thoughts on that. This slide, which again, invisible, is just showing sort of the pros and cons of doing research in both the public sector, where I was at the RBA for a long time, and this sort of relates to any policy institution, and then doing research in the private sector, as I have been over the past year at a not-for-profit company. So in my experience, research in the public sector, one of the nice things about that is you have a kind of very clear research focus. So especially working in something like a central bank, it's all got to be about monetary policy. It's all ultimately got to be about interest rates or about the banks or something like that. So it's very clear. It kind of narrows down what you can actually kind of do research on. There's a dark side to that, or a negative side to that, in that it also means there are certain sort of no-go zones. So there's certain things that you probably can't do research on. So for example, for the RBA, it was not frowned upon, but you generally weren't expected to do work on like fiscal policy or say something about the tax system or something. You could under certain conditions, but in general you can't go commenting what the government's doing because you're meant to be independent and everything. So there are pros and cons, having this kind of very clear research focus on the sorts of topics you could do. The other nice thing about policy institutions, they generally have very well established practices and structures and infrastructure for doing research. So there are big systems in place for producing research papers that can come in various different forms. So things that I produce included like discussion papers and these sort of bulletin articles and the statement of monetary policy. And there's like teams of people that are sort of set up, and their job is to kind of help you edit that and produce that and give you feedback along the way. So that was something that we had at the RBA, so now at E61. The other thing, and everyone says this about every organisation when they leave, is that they miss the people, right? And they miss either their friends or the networks. And this is also true for the RBA and for most policy institutions. It's a strong sort of research support network. You knew who to go to if you had a problem. If you couldn't answer a question, you're sort of stuck on a piece of research. You're like, oh, who do I talk about time series econometrics, or who do I talk about this particular econometric issue? I don't know. There's always someone. Like in a big organisation, there's always someone that you could find to talk to about it. And so I do kind of miss that. The other thing about policy institutions, they're generally very good training grounds. Even if you're thinking about the private sector, it's good to go and do this thing for a couple of years, and often people do. They go into something like the RBA, they do a lot of training, and then go off to the financial sector or wherever. And I think it's good to get a sense of what's important to policymakers when you're there, and you can often pick that up by osmosis, just by being around people talking about policy. You sort of learn what are the big issues that policymakers are thinking about, and you can take that with you as you go off to work in the private sector as well. What's good about working in the private sector and doing research, I really enjoy, and the thing that sort of I felt stifling at the RBA, is the kind of freedom I now have to kind of work on whatever I want to work on. So those no-go zones are no more. I can kind of work on pretty much whatever I want to work on. So for example, right now I'm doing something on the income support system, looking at whether we need to change the way our unemployment benefit system works. So we learned a lot from what happened during COVID with our job seeker program, and so we're sort of looking at some lessons from that and whether we need to kind of increase the rate, make it more flexible over time, maybe change it with economic conditions. So we're doing some research on that. There's no way I would have been able to do that as someone like the RBA. So I enjoy that. It means I've got a broader focus, I've got a lot more autonomy. It's partly from having been around a while and being able to do this that I get to pick what I want to work on, but strongly encourage everyone in the team to pick something that they're passionate about or they're interested in and just go for it. Just do some work on it, do some research, find out something new about the world, share it with everybody through blogs, op-eds. It doesn't even have to be research papers. So we're doing a lot of that right now. The other thing that I like about the private sector, and was very much challenging for me, coming from being at the RBA for a long time, is the exposure that you have to journalists and to other policymakers. So this is, at the RBA, you freak out, you're not allowed to talk to journalists. They're going to ask you what's happening with interest rates or whatever, and you sort of learn tricks and things to sort of avoid those kinds of questions. But now I can talk quite openly about those sorts of things. And I've actually, at first I was freaking out about that, but it's been interesting learning and building connections with journalists, having people to go to. So when I've got a piece of research I want to share with the world, I can now just flick it to the AFR or the SMH or wherever and go, hey, we've got this thing, do you guys want to do something on it? And that's been our experience so far. We just put out a paper for the Job Summit, and five newspapers kind of picked up, and that was kind of exciting and something very different for me. The only other thing with the private sector is there's a lot more uncertainty. As I said, with something like a policy institution, there's a lot of structure. You know how things are going to work. And this is partly the fact that I'm working at a startup research institute. We just don't have that structure. We don't have the systems in place. We're kind of learning as we're going along. So for some people, that's exciting. For me, it is. There's constantly opportunity to innovate. They're like, why don't we set up a survey of businesses or households? I'm like, yeah, let's do it. How are we going to do it? That would have been completely frowned upon if I'd done that within a policy institution potentially. So that's exciting. It's just a lot more opportunity to do different things. But there are good days, there are bad days. Like sometimes, just recently, we were so upset. We had just thought we'd signed a lease for a cool new office space in Surrey Hills in the city. It was a bit Google-esque. It was kind of wooden floorboards, exposed brick, added some lights, all this kind of thing. Like, cool, got the space sorted, about to move in a month, and then the deal fell through. I'm like, oh man, so we're still in, I should say, still in a very nice spot at Macquarie Uni in the city campus, but we really wanted our own little space, and that thing happens all the time. There's good days and bad days. But for me, I'm enjoying that kind of freedom. All right, so what if you're like me? So why do policy research? So one thing, as I said, is I feel in the work that I do, I learn something new every day by going into data sets, finding out some interesting, correlation or graphing something that no one's graphed before. And I like to share it with the world. So I learn new things every day. I get to share it. It's like being, it's a bit wanky, but a detective or a professional gossip or something. I've found out something and I can share it with people, and people can kind of get excited and then go and talk about it. So I can find out stuff about the economics world and then talk to journalists about it. And I think that's cool. It's a great way to make a difference and to feel like you're making a difference. Even when you're at the RBA, you're in a giant organisation, there were still opportunities to sit in a meeting once a month with the governor, the deputy governor, and they would ask for your views on what should they do with interest rates. And I'm not going to say that there was ever a meeting where I suddenly changed their mind on interest rates, but you've got that opportunity, and you feel like you've got that opportunity to actually make a difference. And for me, it's similar in the private sector. Sort of not-for-profit think tank. I'm now working with a lot of other not-for-profits who are looking at issues around disadvantage, as I said, looking at issues around income support, doing some work around poverty and domestic violence. All that stuff is really important to me, and having that opportunity is super exciting. It feels like I can make a difference by if, for example, we do change the income support system. As I said, in terms of tips and tricks for you guys, if you want to get into this sort of space, it's really important to find your brand, work out what it is that you're passionate about, what it is that you're good at, and make that your thing, and sell yourself, not sell your soul, but just make it clear that you're passionate about this thing, and people will come to notice it. One thing that I've learned very late, building connections and networks is super important. I know it shouldn't be that way. I don't like the fact that it is that way, but it is actually important. I've certainly learned that in the private sector. It's, meeting people, talking about what you do and what your organisation does is actually important and builds on itself. And so coming to these kinds of events is super important. Being able to chat to other people, and it's just the way it is. Having these connections really helps. And as I said, basically never stop learning. Constantly jumping between study and work has really worked for me. Going between the undergrad world to work, back to postgrad, I learned a lot. They complement each other very nicely. And I'm still learning a lot, and it's something that, I'm excited about and continue to do in the world of policy research. So that's it for me. Thank you. As I said, we'll share the slides with you guys later. Happy to take questions towards the end. Thanks for having me, guys.
Sweet. Thank you.
Thank you, Gianni. Thanks, that was really insightful. We appreciate you coming today. We'll have Luke up next. Luke's going to talk a bit about lobbying, essentially. We're sorry about the slides, but got them here for the speaker. Hopefully it's okay.
Good one.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Okay, well thanks everyone, and thanks to our hosts for organising this event and for inviting me along. Interesting hearing Gianni give his talk about how he was as an undergrad student, because I had a similar experience. But I actually started out here at Macquarie in the mid-90s, and I, like Gianni, had no idea what I wanted to do. And I started out doing a really generalist arts degree with history, English, politics as my majors. But after a couple of years, I found it really fascinating, by the way. After a couple of years, I decided to transfer to what was called mass communication, to media studies, that sort of thing. Because I was thinking, okay, well, how am I going to get a job after this is done, So ended up doing that and became a journalist straight out of university, which was, again, something that I actually really latched onto and loved. But it was through obviously my earlier studies in politics, but then working as a journalist, where I found myself being really intrigued by public policy debates that were happening in Australia and around the world. And I found myself increasingly drawn to these political stories and writing these stories and interviewing various politicians. Even as a humble rookie journalist working out in country New South Wales, which is what I was doing at the time. And came back to Sydney and again was working in a very well, I guess a low rent newspaper you might call it, but still interviewing ministers, various governments and so on. Found myself just drawn into politics and public policy, and eventually, through informal sort of networks, was invited to become a media advisor in the New South Wales government, which I thought there's absolutely no way I'm going to join the dark side, this early in my career. But I went in and I met the minister at Parliament House, and we had a great discussion. Ended up being just intrigued by the whole thing, and a little bit more money as well, which didn't hurt, for a young guy starting out. So ended up doing that, and I worked as a political advisor for about 7 years with the New South Wales government. Really enjoyed that. It was a fantastic sort of fast-paced kind of interesting kind of career. But I tell you all this because it leads very naturally to where I am today, which is the Director of Government Relations for Macquarie University. And it's that background that sort of led me very naturally to working in government relations, of which the lobbying part is a central part of it, which is what I'm speaking about today. And so there's a sort of a simple distinction between advocacy and lobbying. Advocacy being thought of generally as educating a particular audience about your organisation's or your sector's policy situation, what its challenges are, what its issues are, and what the solutions are. And then of course lobbying, which some people would think is far more pointed, in the sense that you are trying to engage a publicly elected official to vote for a particular piece of legislation. Again, so there's a spectrum. On the one hand, you've got education, then you've got advocacy, and you've got lobbying, and at the other sort of extreme is electioneering, which is very pointed. It's all around election times. It's about a bit of a campaign, be it overt or even behind the scenes, to affect a particular policy outcome. You want a certain candidate or party to be elected to achieve a specific end for your organisation. And so lobbying has, I feel, gained a very negative perception over the years, and probably for very good reason. Whereas advocacy is more associated with charities and not-for-profits and so on, where it's seen as being far more virtuous and well-intentioned. And I think a really good example of this distinction is what we saw it was quite a while ago now, but the Australian government at the time was introducing the Minerals Resources Rent Tax, I think it was called, something like this. Essentially taxing large multinationals, mining companies, on their super profits. So in other words, they're still allowed to make ridiculous profits, but we're going to take a slice of the super profits above a certain threshold. And of course, even though that sounds like very sound public policy, it was, in one sense, it was the death knell of the government, because the extremely powerful mining and mineral lobby conducted this very well-resourced and professional campaign to bring about the end of that particular policy, and it was successful, and it in the process managed to damage a lot of careers along the way. The reason why it was so effective, I believe, it's a complicated story, but if we reduce it, well-resourced companies throwing lots of money at it, professional government relations practitioners working behind the scenes to come up with strategies that are very much multifaceted. They threw a heck of a lot of money at it. I can't remember the figure now, but it was hundreds of millions of dollars in all kinds of marketing, including your mass media, television news and so on, adverts that were all about how wonderful mining is and how every second job in Australia comes from the mining sector, and how without mining the Australian economy would collapse and life as we know it would end. And it was very, very successful. So that's just a good example, I think, of some of these sort of extreme ends. But really, I think a lot of organisations will work across that spectrum at various points in their lives. So as far as Macquarie University goes, so the sort of bread and butter stuff that I'm dealing with, our sort of advocacy and lobbying goals are around establishing and maintaining relationships with different levels of government, all three in our case. And if we do that well, it creates opportunities, and sometimes out of absolutely nothing. So for example, if I manage to establish and then foster a good relationship with a minister's chief of staff, for example, it may build a level of trust between us as individuals where they feel they can actually just reach out, pick up the phone and just say, hey, wanted to pick your brains about something in higher education policy in this state. And that's when you know you've established something that can have mutual benefit. And on one occasion, it actually led to a process that put us in the box seat to get some government funding through a competitive process. And so it was legitimate, but we had a head start. And it's one of those things that happens because you establish those relationships. Now that's a rare example, but there's plenty of others that are probably very similar. But one of our other goals is to promote a better understanding with our key stakeholders of what our strengths are, what our aspirations are. Because even though in Australia's tertiary education sector, there's a fair bit of homogeneity there, in Macquarie's case, we don't just focus on absolutely everything across the board. We have certain strengths, like business and economics, for example. And some of our other goals are to secure capital funding, research funding, teacher program funding, all of these sorts of things. But most importantly, securing policy changes that benefit either us as an organisation or the entire sector as a whole. A really good example of that would be the Job Ready Graduates policy changes that the previous government brought in, which you may or not be familiar with, but essentially a step change in how higher education institutions are funded, or at least the courses that are on offer are funded, how much the government provides to the institution, how much the individual student is expected to contribute via the loan scheme. It's actually a massive transformation. So for example, if you're doing humanities, instead of paying what was a fairly reasonable sum, accruing that HECS debt, you then might be liable for something like 4 or 5 times as much over the course of your degree, which is quite astonishing. These changes were brought in a couple of years ago. There was a little bit of resistance, there was a little bit of hand-wringing, but other than that, it just sailed through. And that's what we have in place today, which affects all of you guys. there's every chance that that the new Australian government will make some adjustments, even though it's not the easiest omelette to unscramble. They've got a university summit coming up, an Accord, Universities Accord. I think it's in November-ish, and that will look at jobs ready graduates package and a whole bunch of related measures. And we hope to achieve meaningful change there, because we think that there's a whole bunch of negative outcomes that flow from that package. Things like making it harder for what you might call equity students to actually access higher education. For example, we know that some of our students that come from low SES backgrounds tend to be drawn to humanities type subjects, even things like law, the kinds of subjects that have been dramatically increased in their cost to the student. And so there's a real disincentive there for, even if it's not a disincentive, because it may not prevent a student from actually signing up to that degree, but it will saddle them with a heck of a lot more debt. And they're already the kind of people in our society that probably should be given a leg up, not extra weight to carry. Moving on. So how does lobbying actually work in the real world? Well, as I said, it's about relationships between people, but there are various other sort of vectors, if you like. So you've got MPs, individual MPs. They may or may not be ministers. They may just be your local MP. Our new federal MP, the member for Bennelong, Jerome Laxale, obviously he's a key stakeholder for me to work with to get my message through him into the Minister for Education and others in the current administration. There's also things like parliamentary committees, which every parliament, be it state or federal, will have a range of committees, and from time to time they will have inquiries, they will have formal hearing processes and so on. And so one of our functions here at Macquarie is to coordinate submissions on behalf of the university, which put a case for a particular outcome, or they illustrate very clearly within the terms of that inquiry, this is our position on this issue. Please take this into account when you're formulating your recommendations to the government. And that's a really effective way of bringing about change, policy change. And then of course you've got other avenues to affecting policy change, like third-party advocacy, being members of groups. For example, Universities Australia, which of course Macquarie is a member of, along with a bunch of other, pretty much all the Australian universities. And they have that sort of coordinating role, getting input from all of us, so we will contribute to papers that they will put forward on our behalf to the government, whether it's part of a formal or an informal process, one of those committees, parliamentary committees and so on. That's really important. And then there's the other kind of third-party advocacy, and there's one that I like to point out, which is like third-party advocacy on steroids. I was talking to a government relations colleague who works in one of the big pharma companies in Macquarie Park, and he was saying that his company is a member of the American Chamber of Commerce, I think he said it was. And so when they get together and lobby the Australian government, it's very easy for them to secure a meeting with the Prime Minister or one of his key ministers, because they can wave around this claim to having X billion dollars in contributions to GDP and employing so many hundreds of thousands of people. When they speak, they get heard. So they're powerful individually, but collectively even more so, because they can talk about these enormous GDP and employment figures, which always impresses government. The other thing I wanted to point out was it's really important in lobbying, you work with your organisation's marketing function. So obviously you have to have consistency of message, but you also have to harness the executive of your organisation. So there's no point me having a scattergun approach to advocacy and lobbying. If I say something that's out of step with what the executive has in their plan, then it's going to be counterproductive and it's going to make somebody look stupid, ultimately me. And so the Vice-Chancellor has got a very important role to play as effectively the CEO of the organisation. And so whatever I do, I make sure it's perfectly in sync with his and the executive's plans for the future. So we actually will strategise and we'll get together regularly to make sure that we're on the same page. And then of course there's plenty of limitations, particularly, for example, if you're working for a not-for-profit or a charity, there are actually statutory limitations on what you can and can't do. And plenty of people will get in trouble from time to time for aligning themselves too closely with a political party or a candidate. There's plenty of examples, I can't think of them off the top of my head, but I think there was one example in the recent federal election campaign where a CEO of one of the charities was publicly rebuked for promoting a candidate, I think. So this person's candidates are fantastic, they align with our core goals. And then there's a bunch of, I guess, mechanisms around lobbying that seek to improve the transparency of this sort of activity, because it is a little bit murky. And that's things like lobbyist registers. So if you work for a private company, for example, let's say you work for a consultancy and you lobby on behalf of a company, you have to be on a register, whether there's one at different state and federal levels. And then there's of course things like meeting disclosure forms. So if you want to go in and you want to talk to a government minister about a particular subject, advocate for policy change, whatever it is, you will usually be asked to fill out a disclosure form saying this is who I am, this is who I'm representing, this is what I want to talk about, and who you're bringing to the meeting, that sort of thing. And then of course these days there's also requirements for ministers to publish diaries, sort of different mechanisms in place at different levels, but it's designed to be a transparency mechanism so that the public can say at some point, oh, last month, the Minister for Education met with a representative from Macquarie University and they spoke about the Job Ready Graduates package, for example. Then there's other things like, for example, we recently wanted to go to lunch with the Minister for Education in New South Wales. It was essentially building that relationship. And it was the VC, and it was the Minister, and the Chief of Staff, and it was me. Behind the scenes, very, very subtly, I reached out and said, listen, I'll bring the credit card, I'll pay for us, you pay for you, okay? And he said, yep, totally on the same page, because nobody wants this perception that there's undue influence anyway, even though there still is in various other sectors, because, as I say, it can be a very professional kind of a setup. Here at Macquarie, there's me, and that's about it, but I was sort of, as I say, work very closely with colleagues around the place to make sure that we're in line in terms of our strategic priorities. But in terms of, I already talked about how I got into the role, so yeah, I think that's probably about it. Other than to say, look, lots of different avenues into lobbying and government relations. In my case, it was media, but economics, I think, is a really important skill set in public policy analysis. So it's definitely a really sound platform for if you're thinking about anything on this role. And of course, there's you might work in bureaucracy for a while and then find yourself working in politics. And then, interestingly enough, the Australian government that just came in, they ran a sort of a merit-based selection recruitment process for their ministerial staff, which is a little bit unusual in my practice, in my experience, because usually it's a networking thing. You know someone who knows someone, they ask you to come in, you do the job. This was more of a merit-based public recruitment process, which I thought was quite interesting. But that's about it for me. Until we go to questions.
Being here, and thanks
the Economic Society for putting this event together and so forth. I actually didn't really have any slides. I had 3 words on one slide, so I'm not going to miss the slides very much from here. I tend to wander around, but no one's ever told me I need a microphone, so I'll just learn from here. Okay, so we've heard about the idea, the research thing. We've heard about the lobbying. We want your idea here. The question that I want to talk about is implementation. In particular, what makes good policy in the sense that it actually addresses a problem in a meaningful way? Because after all, what's the point of addressing a problem in a non-meaningful way? That sounds so obvious, and yet most of the times the things that are proposed are actually non-meaningful. They don't have any real impact of what's going on. And the second part is if you're going to try and do something, particularly if it's meaningful, how do you make sure it sticks? What's the point of bringing in a carbon tax if the next government's just going to eliminate it? You've just wasted all the time and effort and whatever. So I'm going to talk about, from my experience, what I've learned about how to make policy or how to implement policy in a way that talks about those 2 rubrics. Because if you think about it, they're the only things that matter. Okay? It really doesn't matter if you have a good idea if it's not going to ever be adopted in a meaningful way, and it certainly doesn't mean much if you've got a good idea if it's not going to stick from there. Now, how can I talk about all this stuff? Well, basically I've worked for the last 25, 30 years or something, I've never quite worked it out, in policy implementation itself. So after I finished uni, just to do the sort of, my song line here, after I finished uni, I went down to Canberra and worked in the Australian government. I worked in the Prime Minister's department down there. Bob Hawke was the Prime Minister. Fantastic guy, by the way. Bit bizarre, but there you go. But the really exciting thing was it wasn't just Hawke down there, it was Keating as well. And I'm going to talk a bit about my sort of experiences and observations of him. I mean, I was a young thing like you folks there were. And so for me, it was all just amazing to see all this stuff and going on. And it's only later on that I've come to kind of think about what was actually happening. It's funny what you learn after the fact. Right when you're right in the middle of it, it's sort of hard to take some of the lessons, but I'll come back to that in a moment. After I'd been down in Canberra for a while, I rapidly realised that I need a lot more education. I, unlike others, I actually kind of knew that I wanted to be an economist all the way back when I was in high school. And I even knew that I probably wanted to join the IMF. I knew a couple of people and that was the place for me. Well, I found out that actually you've got to have a PhD if you're going to join the IMF, and I didn't, of course. I only had an undergrad degree, and so therefore I realised I needed more studies. And so first I went to Germany and got a master's degree in Germany, and then I went to America and got another master's degree in America, and then I got a PhD there. My advice to all of you, those who've heard me before, have heard this sad song very strong, remember this is not your only degree. Whatever you do, go work for 3 or 4 years and then go back and do something. A master's degree, if you really want to do a PhD, that's great, but at least a master's degree, because you will learn so much more. When you come back to study, having got a few runs under the board of a bit of experience, whatever that is, doesn't matter, corporate, public sector, whatnot, you'll see the world in a very different way. You'll also have a clearer idea about what you really want to specialise in. That's what master's degrees are about. Specialising in economic policy, or specialising in finance, or specialising in marketing, or whatever you want to do. You will see it in that light. So keep that in mind. It doesn't have to be overseas, could be here, whatever, doesn't matter, but just keep that in mind from here. So I went overseas and did some more studies, ended up in the States, and then finally I applied for one job when I finished my PhD to the IMF, and I got one job at the IMF. And so I put all in one bucket there, but it came out well for me. And so then I was at the IMF for a bit over a dozen years. I joined the IMF just before the Soviet Union imploded, and so it was a really exciting time to be at the IMF about how do you turn all of these new 15 countries, all what they were republics in the Soviet Union, and how do you turn them all into market economies, or as the Americans like to call them, capitalist economies, very proudly with a big smile on their face. And I was thinking, well, you got the marketing of that wrong right up front. Anyway, that was the task, and then it went on to more and more stuff. The Asia financial crisis happened, there's the Western Hem crises happened, and so it went through. Anyway, then after a while, I said, well, that's really exciting, but now what's the next thing? And so then I came to the Reserve Bank,
and I joined the Reserve Bank as a relatively senior official there. And as Darcy was saying, I worked for a while in the Economic Analysis Department, which is essentially the interest rate department at the RBA. That's where the kind of percolating goes about should you go up, down, or stay the same. I once had a friend who said, you have such an easy job, you make one decision every month and that's it. And I thought, yeah, well, you ought to see the amount of time that goes into that one decision. Anyway, and then worked in a really fascinating part of a financial stability department, which was essentially about what regulations do we work with APRA and ASIC on about trying to make the banks a safer place, and I'm going to talk a bit about that as well from there. And then after I'd done that for a dozen years or so, I thought, okay, that's fine. A dozen years seems to be about my thing. And then what do I want to do next? And then I came to Macquarie Uni. And by the way, I've loved being at Macquarie Uni. I really love interacting with all of you folks, talking about how to think about the world, how to say, well, you know, if I was in your shoes, what would I want someone to tell me about, and so forth. And hence that brings us to today, where I'm sure my other three panelists feel the same way as I do. It's terrific to be able to feel that you have this opportunity to pass on to you folks some ideas that we've had. Up to you whether you take it or not, but at least the best we can do is to expose you to the ideas. My advice, take it, okay? Because remember, there's two ways of getting knowledge. One, you live it and it takes 25 years. The other, you listen to people who've already done it and then it takes about 15 minutes. Okay, so you choose the cost benefit of that from there. But anyway, that's by and by. Right, so three things I want to talk about of policy implementation and how I think it really goes on. It's going to talk about prioritization, I'm going to talk about risk mitigation, and I'm going to talk about communication on those three aspects, okay? Prioritization, what do I mean about prioritization? Imagine you're the Albanese government coming in, okay? And you've been out of power for, how long have you been out of power? 10 years? 7 years, okay, thank you very much. Ours, of course, is on top of all that.
Yeah.
All right, okay, so quite a while. And how many things do you think that they want to do?
A lot.
A lot. 100, 150 if you add up all the ministries, whatever. I don't know, whatever it is. How many things do you think that they are going to be able to get the political focus to be able to do, including the focus of the voters to be able to do in their first, I don't know, 18 months? Not that many, exactly. Prioritization is all about not seeing the 150 things you could do, and that all of which are worthy, at least in the eyes that you look at them. It's working out the 3 or 4 that are actually going to really matter for your agenda, your particular perspective. Okay? And that is a really tough part. It is very easy for people to have nice big fat reports, they're called World Bank reports, outlining everything that should happen with the 400 recommendations at the end in any reform program or whatever else from there. It is much harder to use your capabilities, and I'll get back to that in a moment, to say amongst these 400, these are the 3 that will matter. And this is why it's those 3 and not the other 397. Because that is where the real premium lies when you work in policy. It's being able to point out why it's those 3 that you're going to go forward on. And how do you find those 3? How do you decide what is the prioritization of that? Which ones would matter if you were able to get some traction on those particular aspects? And how do you think you work on it? The number one thing you've got to have is a very clear framework about how the world works. How the world works and how your particular problem works. So you've got to be able to really be informed about the particular sector you're looking at, the particular country and its circumstances, whatever it is, or in fact just the whole way that the world comes together in my case, an economic frame. So for instance, when I went to Ukraine for the first time, I got moved to Ukraine by the IMF and I lived there for several years. And when I got moved to Ukraine, inflation was 10,000%. Makes our 8% look a bit puny, doesn't it? They were 10,000%. They had lost 60% of GDP. Even in the Russia invasion, they haven't lost 60% of GDP. From that, they had lost 60% of all of their output. Money was floating in the streets, totally worthless. In fact, more than half the economy, 55% of the economy was in barter, with people swapping their food for whatever they needed in terms of tables or items or paying for insurance or whatever. Arrears were massive because nobody had any money to pay anything, or at least they claimed they didn't have any money to pay anything, and so forth. Where do you start? Do you start on the emerging HIV problem, which is happening in Ukraine at the same time? It's an important issue, definitely. So I was the res rep there, and I was being lobbied, Mark's point of view, by a whole stack of people that were trying to get their particular issue to the top. Because one thing that the IMF has, remember, is no country calls the IMF until no one else will answer your phone. It's only when everyone else is not answering your calls that the countries call the IMF and say, we need your help. So things are already pretty desperate by definition on whatever it is. And that means that you now have the ability to go in and say, we know you need the 400 million or the 500 or a billion or whatever it is. It's all just cash anyway. But in order to get this, you're going to have to do these 3 or 4 things. And these 3 or 4 things are what the IMF economists have worked out are the priorities to make a difference. And why does it have to be those 3 or 4 things? Well, for the reasons I've already said, there's not much point in getting people energized on things that just don't matter. You want to have impact. The country's in a hole, you want to get out of it as fast as you can. But the other thing that's very important, in particular a lot of countries, and I would say virtually most countries, they have a real limited capacity at the political level to handle more than a few things. A lot of the countries I went to at the IMF, there was 1, maybe 2 people who could make any decision in the entire country at all, in a political sense. I once went to Turkmenistan. In fact, I went there 8 times, but anyway. Went to Turkmenistan. There was only 1 guy who we would interact with to make the policies, and he was the same guy that would authorize the aeroplanes to land at the airport. Because he was the only guy who had the authority to basically decide anything whatsoever. So what's the point of going for 200 things to this chap and say, here are the things you need to do to get around Turkmenistan? Weird story going to Turkmenistan. There were no planes. There was a private plane you had to charter, which was the Sultan of Brunei's plane we used to pick up in Switzerland, fly into Ashgabat in this plane with gold fillings and all that sort of stuff, and then eat cucumbers and bread for a week, because that was the only food that they had. And then you get back on the plane again at the end of the week and it would all be back on again. It's just the bizarre sort of world that you go. Anyway, my point is, you've got to focus on what are the 3 or 4 things. If you want to be really valuable, that's what you've got to be able to train yourself to do. To be realizing that it's easy and cheap to talk about the 200 things that should happen. You hear it on the popular stuff, Q&A and all that sort of thing. We should do this, we should do that, we should do that. Yeah, sure, we should do a lot of different things. But we can't. We need to do only a small number of them. And that is the challenge. To do that, you've got to have a really clear framework to understand what it is, how the issue's going, talk with a lot of people to work out how that issue goes, and then work it out. And by the way, sometimes it's not just 3 issues across a number of different economy. Sometimes it's just a narrow set of issues within one area. So I worked on the pension reform in Turkey in, 2000 or something like that. In Turkey, you used to be able to retire at the age of 39.
What?
Retire at the age of 39. Not everyone could. You had to have started working at 14 and all this sort of stuff. But nonetheless, you could retire at that age. So the question was, well, how do you start moving a system that's clearly bankrupt towards a way that is going to actually get around, put it on a stable footing? And what are the 2 or 3 things that are going to make a big, big difference from there? And then, so in our case, what we found out is to say, well, hey, stop raising pensions at the rate of the growth of wages in the rest of the economy, grow them only at the CPI. And you're going to save 5% a year on the cost of your pension bill because the economy is growing and real wages are growing at 5% a year. But you've got to then say, as part of that prioritization stuff, okay, now how do we actually make sure that the population is going to accept it? And in the case of Turkey, what you did was you didn't have the reforms come in until 5 years hence. So that anyone who was thinking they were just about to retire because they were 38 didn't get affected by this. And you phase it in, and then eventually everyone thinks that it's normal and they have to do it. Anyway, my point is prioritization matters. Coming up with the right policies that are narrow and focused and will make a difference to the problem is what you have to do. And it's hard. It's really hard because you have to keep saying no to things that are very good ideas, but they're not part of the 3 or 4 that are the most important. By the way, those 3 or 4, you want them to say not that you can do everything. You want to talk to the government about, well, how far can you go in these things? And I'll come back to that in a moment. Risk mitigation. Life is full of risks, okay? The future is uncertain. You have to, as a public policy official, decide what are the probabilities of what's going on, but you can never know what is going to happen in the future. So you see this a lot in the whole idea of the regulators, particularly banking sector regulators. I was saying to a group this week, perhaps I think some of you are in this room, that look, one of the hard things about being a regulator is that you have to sit yourself in the middle of 2 consenting adults. It's one private consenting adult that wants to lend because they think it's profitable for them to lend, and one private consenting adult that wants to borrow because they think it's going to be good for them in terms of whatever they want to do with the money. And you, the regulator, a bureaucrat of all things, not elected, not anything else, sit smack in the middle of that and you say no. And on what basis? Because you say in the future, we think that the systemic risk of that and those sorts of activities is going to be too high, it might lead to a crisis. What do you think the 2 private consenting adults think about that idea? They're very unhappy. They're very, very unhappy about what's going on. And because they come to you, and what's the very first question they come to you and say? Why? Why? How do you know that's what's going to happen in the future? And as a bureaucrat, what do you honestly have to say? I don't. I can't know. There's no way of me knowing for sure what's going to happen on there. But my training, my understanding, my seeing 10 crises beforehand, or in my case 25 of them, they follow me around a bit, is a way of understanding that this is likely to happen. And because the cost of crises is so large, over 60% of GDP, that we are not going to allow this to happen, and hence I'm going to sit in the middle of it. Now, to do that kind of risk mitigation, first of all, you've got to have, you've got to be pretty confident of yourself. You've got to know what you're talking about and make sure you're not jumping at shadows. Very easy to jump at shadows. Maybe this will happen. Well, lots of things may happen. You've got to say, is it a significant threshold that it's going to happen? And that means you've got to have a lot of knowledge about what's happened in the past, what's going on, why this time looks like previous times, and so on. Secondly, of course, you must have independence to be able to do it. You must be devoid from the political process. Imagine if, the Reserve Bank's putting up interest rates right now. Imagine if Canberra had to sign off on all those interest rate increases that have happened in the last, 5 months? 5 months, 6 months, whatever it is. How do you think that would have gone?
They wouldn't sign it.
They wouldn't have signed it. And why would governments not have signed it? Because governments love running with the odds. They love trying to pretend that, you know what, yes, if I roll the dice, yeah, I might throw a 7, an 8, and a 9, but you know what, I might also throw a double 6, which will get me out of the problem. And governments love rolling dice with a double 6. We saw this a lot in the Asia financial crisis, where it was clear as day that these countries were running up against balance of payments problems. Well, actually, capital reserve problems. And indeed, there were secret missions to warn these countries, to say this is not right. They're going in with false passports and all this sort of stuff that was going through there on tourist visas and whatnot. And the governments would look at you and they say, how come you know I won't throw a double 6? What do you have to answer?
It's black and white.
I can't tell you. Maybe you're right. Yeah, I know my country better than you do. You're right, you do. But I know 25 other crises better than you do as well, is the only response. But in the end, they're the elected officials and you walk away. I once worked on South Africa, where during the apartheid period, when they switched over from apartheid and they switched over to an elected government, the ANC one, and I was on the team there, and we had to go around, and it was obvious that there could be a real currency crisis when the elections were going to happen. And so we went around to come up with a sort of a loan on the quiet for South Africa to basically make sure that if there were a problem, they had $1 billion sitting in the bank to be able to draw on to stabilise the currency and so forth from there. We had to get approval from 23 different political parties to do this loan. This is the IMF talking to the Communist Party in South Africa. How well do you think that went? And yet we managed to get them on board. Because we were able to say that, look, just risk mitigation. You may never draw on this thing no debt, nothing. But risk mitigation means you need to have this. In the end, it was all fine. They never had to draw on it from there. And that brings me to my last and final point, which is communication. There is no point in coming up with a policy, in announcing a policy, and then wondering why you get the pushback on communication. You must bring people along in a dialogue as they go through, because I don't know how many people in this room, 50 people in this room, all of us differ in our thoughts about what's going on, the preferences we have, how we think that life should be, what we think is good policy, what they think is good policy. All this has got to come together somehow so that we have a unified policy and perspective on what's going on. And to do that, you've got to have a set of voices being able to be brought into the process. And what I mean by that is you've got to explain honestly to people what is really going on. Look at the dialogue right now. Do you really think that's an honest portrayal of the issues that are happening out there? Pick any issue you like and decide if you think that's an honest portrayal to people. The clarity of what actually our choices are and what's going on from there. You've got to talk through the language of the other side. There is no point in communicating in my language if you folks don't understand. I didn't do any communication. You must communicate in the way that other people understand it and bring around focusing on the essence. I mentioned Keating before, and this guy was just a master at this. You would watch him when the officials, the Treasury, explaining to him what the issues were, using all their jargon and whatever, and Keating was a very smart guy. Left school at the age of 15, joined Parliament at the age of 24, and was as sharp as a razor in being able to understand what was happening. And they would speak with all their jargon and all that stuff. And then he would just absorb it, get on 2GB, and he would use a language that no one had ever spoken before, and we would just cut straight through to talk about the fact at that time Australia's commodity prices had collapsed by 30-40%. We had to live within our means, quote unquote, and make the adjustments that were necessary, and he got it through. Banana Republic and all the rest of the stuff, he got it through. And it was just a miracle. You just watched him and you thought, wow, this is a guy who understands. There's no point in having the right idea if you can't communicate. And all that. So that's a really, really important part. Communication also means you've got to let the voices that will oppose you have a view. Mark mentioned the mining tax fiasco, which it was. In my view, it was a fiasco because this was a government that got a report, didn't release the report for 9 months, released it one day before, in fact, on the night of the budget where they announced the new policy and released the budget at the same time, and then wondered why they got the opposition from the people who were going to lose, the mining companies, and thought were just like deers in headlights as they sat and said, oh, how come you're so upset? You must allow the voices that you know will oppose you to have a voice, to be coming in, to be talking about it, to let them vent a little bit, to try to come up, and most importantly, if you want to go forward in one way in a policy that sticks, be willing to adjust the policy to best address the challenges that people come up with. The problem with the mining tax, in my view, was that the government said it's retrospective. Doesn't matter when you did the policy, you now start, the investment, you now start paying the tax. Instead of being forward-looking, all new mines that start from here are going to be exposed to a super profits tax. And that's just my view, it doesn't really matter. But imagine if we had a dialogue that had been around that kind of a way, rather than the actual way that it did. And imagine if they brought in the people that could actually talk about their opposition to it or what's going on, and then come up with a way from it. So they're the three things that I think are really important to implement. If you are interested in a public policy world, it is fascinating. I mean, the examples I've just given here are just a small fraction of the sort of things that I've had the great pleasure of dealing with. There are thousands more that are going to happen in the next 30, 40 years. It's very exciting, it's very dynamic, but if you want to be effective, make sure you know about prioritization. Make sure you know about risk mitigation and why you think that's important. And finally, communicate with people. And make sure you hear the voices, because there's no point, as I said at the beginning, in having the right idea if the policy's not going to stick. Thank you.
Definitely a good speech on policy implementation. We'll have John up now to talk a little bit about policy evaluation. And thanks again for showing up at such short notice, John.
Okay, no worries. Thanks for having me here, and actually it's quite a good crowd for this time of semester. This is a good turnout. Actually, when I was in your position, sort of ending my towards the end of my undergraduate studies, is that I never thought I was going to become an economist. Certainly not an academic economist. At the time, I think the end of the Keating government had helped drive Australia deep into recession, and my view of was that economics hadn't taught us much at all. But a few years later, I found myself working at the Reserve Bank of Australia, and I found myself very impressed with the people that I was working with and the work that they were doing. So I was put immediately into the research group in the Reserve Bank of Australia, and it was a very small group, but it had some very talented members. So a deputy head of department, the former Phil Lowe, who you now know as the governor of the Reserve Bank, a newly minted PhD economist out of MIT, Guy DeBell, who until recently was the deputy governor of the Reserve Bank. A senior economist, David Gruen, who was kind of following in Phil Lowe's footsteps, moved on to Prime Minister of Cabinet, is now the head of the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And the time that I moved in is that there was a new fad developing in central banks. I shouldn't call it a fad. But central banks had particularly often had troubles with containing inflation since the inflation emerged in the mid-1970s in particular. And Australia was one of the countries that had particular problems in containing inflation, mostly because they didn't really have a serious monetary policy since the abandonment of fixed exchange rates in the mid-1970s. And so, but now there was this new thing beginning to develop in the form of inflation targeting, and the central bank really wanted to and Australia was kind of moving towards adopting an inflation target. So one thing that came out of the recent recession was that inflation was actually brought down in Australia to very low levels, and so the central bank kind of thought, well, maybe we can sort of maintain inflation at these low levels. And so this was the process when they began actually developing informally what's now formalized as the inflation target. And as I was involved in this process, and we actually had a whole conference on this process, it had just again struck me just how well a very well-trained economist can think very subtly and very well about some very deep issues. And there's some very powerful tools to bring to bear to evaluate a whole range of policies, where there's very important macroeconomic policies such as an inflation target, or what more of you are more likely to work on, sort of microeconomic policies as well. And so economists, well-trained economists, are actually given an immensely powerful toolkit, which, if they think carefully about problems, can be used to actually evaluate a whole host of problems and policy solutions to them. And so And so I liked my job at the Reserve Bank, and they must have liked me. They also gave me a scholarship to study. So I spent 4 years at MIT doing graduate study. I didn't go back though. I fulfilled the terms of my contract, but I didn't go back. Leave that aside. However, after an academic career at the University of Chicago, eventually returning to the University of Sydney, and now here. But I kind of saw what students, some talented undergraduate students could do in terms of policy evaluation, even at, say, at the University of Sydney. And so some students could actually take some policies, even some very controversial policies, find some data that was relevant to it, and actually conduct very interesting evaluations of those policies. So I remember one undergraduate student, and I'm not sure whether it's because of his interests or his advisor's interests, were actually studying the effect of marijuana law reform in Colorado. And so essentially it's one of those things where Colorado, as you might realize, many US states have kind of legalized marijuana consumption and to varying degrees. And however, there's some concern about, well, what's actually the impact of those particular policies. And people didn't actually know what the impact of those policies were, but it's something that's potentially ripe for evaluation. Now, what an economist would really like is a thing that health economists get to do. Like, for example, you might have realized when they're constructing those testing the efficacy of COVID vaccines, they give half of people the real thing and half of people some other injection, and then trace what happens to those who get the real thing versus those who get the injection over time. In economics, while we could be able to do those things, often policymakers don't like implementing policy in that sort of fashion, and you can kind of understand why they don't necessarily want to implement policy in that sort of fashion. But sometimes policy gives rise to things that are called sort of natural experiments, where basically two different groups are effectively treated, two groups are treated slightly differently in a way that doesn't necessarily correlate in a serious way to any underlying differences between the two groups. And therefore you can use these sort of differences in treatment as some sort of natural experiment to evaluate the policy. So the terms of this marijuana policy, this student, is that there was actually some randomness to where the dispensaries ended up being located. And proximity to dispensaries is something that actually affects the likelihood of people actually making use of the products of those dispensaries. And therefore you could kind of leverage this in a data-based analysis of, well, what's the actual effect of increased marijuana consumption that comes from this sort of policies on various outcomes, whether it's road accident deaths or whether it's things like taking of other substances or even things like drinking alcohol, for example. And so an undergraduate student with training that would have been very similar to yours was actually able to do a very interesting piece of policy design, policy evaluation. And actually, partly as a result of that, one of his job offers was from the Victorian Department of Health. Is that the Department of Health was really interested, not merely just in that particular topic, but the fact that this person could use non-conventional, well, ways that weren't conventional in health to actually analyze what was a health, in some sense, a health policy. And so, so that's one example of how economists can be very good at policy evaluation. But they can also do things that are study things that are much more controversial even than that. So for example, in Australia, currently a very controversial thing that's about to die a death is the cashless welfare card. Right? And so it's something, policy that was introduced, probably this was based on, thoughts of, whatever the reasoning behind the policy, maybe I shouldn't say whatever the reasoning was behind the policy, but some people thought it was a great idea, other people thought it was a terrible idea. But what we didn't necessarily know is, well, what was the actual impact of that thing? Now, this is a thing that's amenable to analysis, and yet we don't see a lot of public debate about, well, what was the actual effect of this thing? Now, there has been some studies of it, and sometimes you actually see some rather surprising effects of policies. You might think, okay, this is a great idea for this sort of reason, but often policies actually throw up some very surprising effects, but without some sort of rigorous study of it, is that we never really know. And also one of the undergraduate students we had was actually working in a community where this was actually a policy that bit. And I remember one of the findings that appeared to be coming out of one of these studies was that actually what might superficially seem surprisingly, but they actually found evidence of decreased school participation after the implementation of this policy, which might seem a little bit surprising. I don't want to go into the suggested reasons for that. Other things like the Northern Territory intervention. So where there's a lot of restrictions on alcohol sales, a lot of restrictions on other other sort of direct interventions into Indigenous communities, and an undergraduate student allied with an advisor, but a lot of the work was done by the undergraduate student, gaining the trust of the community so they could actually do effective study of the effects of this particular intervention. Highly controversial, and yet a lot of the debate as to whether what should be done wasn't really based on a very hard-edged analysis of the evaluation of the policy. But if you don't evaluate policies, it's all sorts of things that might seem like good ideas can have very surprising consequences, and it's important that evaluation is just much more systematic. So remember when I was a graduate student, somebody was involved in a lot of these little micro sort of development studies, field studies. There's one thing where, like, in some countries, malaria is still rampant. And one way to potentially control malaria, and therefore, and this is a really debilitating disease for many of the sufferers of it. So one particular intervention that was brought about was saying, well, let's hand out mosquito nets. Right? So if you give out mosquito nets, then essentially this is something that can lead to hopefully fewer mosquito bites, therefore less malaria, and hopefully better economic outcomes. But what was found in some of the communities was that, well, mosquito nets have alternative uses. And mosquito nets sewn together can be highly efficient fishing nets. And unfortunately, a mosquito net's very fine, so it actually catches everything. And basically doesn't leave enough of the small fish to grow large and reproduce, and so therefore they ended up depopulating fish stocks in the local water resources. And so one thing where it's like, this shows even the policies you might think are just so obvious is that no, careful evaluation of policies is actually essential. And too often, I think large policies are kind of put in place and without actual careful analysis of those sort of policies. But economists, with well trained both in theory and in data analysis, could often actually have the tools to do very sensible evaluation of policy, even where things haven't been set up as some sort of controlled experiment. So so take the incoming government, for example. Now, the new government is that its largest new policy is on childcare. Right? So the childcare policy, I think they're going to spend $5.1 extra billion on it over the kind of the forward estimates of the budgets. That's like over a 4 or 5 year period. And given that relative to current policies, that will mostly be expenditures on upper middle to higher income households, the way it's structured. And it's kind of, well, what's the impact of that policy? Well, it'd be nice to know it'd be nice to know what the effect of that is on, say, labour market participation decisions of households, for example. How much extra does this get second income earners into the workforce? What does this actually do for the economy? Particularly with this money being directed towards higher income households in particular, it's like, well, you'd want to expect to get some sort of economic return bang to the buck. This cannot just be a welfare policy, since most of this is actually directed to higher income households. Well, it turns out even though this isn't implemented in a sort of a controlled experiment sort of fashion, there's some natural features of the design of past childcare policies that would actually enable an economist to work out what the labour market participation decisions, etc., are of this. And that is because there's discontinuities in the design of the policy. So for example, households that might have been on, say, $320,000 family income might get, say, a 80% rebate. Whereas households on a $360,000 income might be down to a 0 or 50%, a much lower rebate. So the difference between a household on, say, $340,000 and $360,000 total income is probably not a lot of difference between those households. And yet they get a very different treatment in terms of the effective price they pay for childcare. And an economist who has training both in labour economics, or just even more basic microeconomics, as well as econometrics, go and work out, well, I can actually study the difference between behaviours of households at $340,000 versus $360,000 because they've been given very different childcare policies, and essentially work out, well, what are the implications of this policy. So economists, whether you know it or not, you're very well trained, you actually have a lot of toolkit to do this with. The unfortunate thing is that too little of it is done in government, although there's a suspicion, I have a suspicion that a little bit more might be done in coming years in some areas. Some things will just be policies will be impervious to this sort of thing. But in some sense, a lot of economists are getting employed in some sense to sort of indirectly evaluate some policies. So I ran a program at Sydney looking after a lot of undergraduate students and tracked what their employment outcomes actually were. And for this group of students, the biggest set of employers were consulting firms, either management consulting firms or economics consulting firms. And a lot of that is indirectly evaluating some sort of policies in some sense, particularly the economic consulting firms. And a lot of the economics consulting firms are hiring these economists because the government was actually issuing contracts for them to do this work. Now that might subtly change in coming years because one of the policies of the new government is to reduce spending on consultants. However, a lot of that work will still need to be done, so what might happen is more direct hiring into government departments. So essentially, you might find that in coming years, the mix of employment for new undergraduates will actually change. It's kind of, so many of you might end up being able to be involved in sort of policy evaluation in some way. Even the government doesn't always act on those policy evaluations. But it's actually one of the most interesting things that economists can actually do, because just by an interaction of your knowledge of economic theory, which leads you to know, okay, well, economics is about the study of choices and behaviours, and you can see situations where some people should turn out to behave differently relative to others, and use that to actually work out, well, what's the implication, what's the effects of particular policies. And if you ally that with data analysis skills, like through econometrics or other data analysis disciplines, you offer that combination of this insight into how things work, combined with the ability to actually evaluate things ex post as well when you see actual data, is something that's hugely valuable both in public sector, should be more valuable in the public sector, but the private sector likes it too. So, your ability to do policy evaluation, and also your ability therefore to actually evaluate a whole range of other similar type problems, is something that's potentially immensely valuable to you in the labour force, and something that you should aim to develop, and when you're in interviews for consulting firms and or government policy departments, exploit to the fullest. And by the way, it looks like 3 of us have worked for Reserve Bank of Australia. I think that came at a period, like, there was a time when the Reserve Bank of Australia really was the place to start in the public sector. I'm less convinced that that's true now. I've seen that the Reserve Bank's program has kind of changed from the days when I was there to something that's a bit more formulaic, and so I don't think you get the same sort of bespoke treatment that you used to get when we were there. And I actually think that some of the programs in other government agencies, whether it's Productivity Commission or APRA or Treasury, a whole range of other departments, and including state government agencies too, I think provide opportunities for advancement and interesting careers that are at least equal to that of the RBA. So cast your net widely, develop those skills. Sorry, what I might have said is only a bit more tangentially related to policy evaluation you might be looking for, but I hope this has been helpful. And thanks very much.
Thank you.